I'll give everyone a bit of a background on Nick. So besides writing this book, Dr. Nicholas Sutton is from Birmingham. He's the director of the Department for Continuing Education at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. Nick lectured in religious studies for the Open University and in Hinduism for the University of Nottingham. He's contributed to a number of academic journals on the Hindu tradition, as well as chapters in books. His work has also brought him into close contact with Hindu communities in the north of England, where he worked with Preston College and local temples in organising courses of study in Hindu scripture and Hindu religious practice. And then, of course, he's the author of this translation that we're currently reading.
Yeah, I think that's a little out of date, actually. I've moved on from academic work. Well, I just found academia frustrating in a lot of ways. So what I want to do always now is teach and write things that people actually read, which doesn't apply to academic material, which doesn't work. So I've given up on doing academic publications. I just want to produce stuff that people can read and understand. I've gone on a little bit since that was written.
Okay, nice. That's where we are at the minute.
Okay.
Should I pass over to you, Paris?
Thanks, Abhilasha. Hi, Nick. Absolute pleasure to have you.
Hello.
The first question is, could you give us an overview regarding translating Sanskrit text into English? Do translations differ much, and are there any key points or divergence?
Yeah, it's difficult because I suppose inevitably when one does translate, one enters the field of interpretation and commentary, which I always try to avoid. Try to give it as literal a translation as possible, but at the same time one that makes sense. So, for example, I'll give it some examples in the first chapter where Arjuna is referred to as Kapidhwaj. You'll see that often translated as having Hanuman on his flag, which it is, of course, but Kapi means a monkey. So I translate that as having a monkey or an ape on his banner and leave it to the commentary to say Hanuman. Then you've got in Robert Zahner's translation, for example, Paramatma. He translates that as the oversoul, which really doesn't mean anything, does it? I mean, what is an oversoul? It sounds like something you might buy from a shop on cold weather or something like that. There's no such thing in the English language. And also when you use a word like soul or mind or intellect, already English-speaking people have a conception in their mind of what those words mean. And that conception probably isn't directly the same as what the word manas, buddhi, etc. means. So increasingly over the years, I've taken to leaving Sanskrit terms untranslated, particularly something like dharma or something like that, because and then allowing the context to explain what is meant. And I also try to give a lot of the translations you'll get reflect a particular sampradaya into it. I'm thinking of particularly the ISKCON version, which is great, fine. It's really useful, but you have to bear in mind that it's translated from the perspective of a particular sampradaya. And another one I've got here, this one, is Shankaracharya's commentary, and it's translated from the perspective of Advaita. And I suppose ideally the translator's task is to steer a middle course and try and say what the text itself is saying. Inevitably then you become something of an interpreter. So it's a difficult task actually, but that's what I always aim to do. Try as far as possible to let the text speak for itself without imposing any external interpretation upon it, and then leaving it up to the commentators, read the commentators to see the different interpretations of it. Is that all right? Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Nick. Just on the back of that one as well, there was a follow-up. Is there any translations that you like or dislike?
Um, yeah, yes and no. I mean, I use them. I have to admit, I use them. I always prefer, if I'm honest, to go back to the translations from the original commentator's perspective. So I've got this one as well, which is a commentary with Ramanuja's Bhashya. So I prefer what you might call translations from within the tradition rather than translations from outside the tradition. I'm a little suspicious of academic impositions on them. So I like to hear what a lot of these come from the Ramakrishna mission. And again, I've got like this one for the Mandukya Upanishad. This is by Swami Sarvananda. Again, it's published by the Ramakrishna Math. I tend to refer to those, but always bearing in mind that they are coming from a particular perspective, and I tend to look at different ones and and try and find a balance between them rather than going to one in particular. I think I'd say that. I quite like Robert Zahner's version, but again, I think sometimes, as I was saying, like Oversoul and Paramatma, sometimes his translations don't really translate, do they? Because there's no such word as Oversoul. So you're not really conveying a meaning there, are you? So, but generally, what you might call the indigenous translations, I find more, I gravitate towards more.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. Abhilasha?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I guess that leads me quite nicely on to the next question, which is, so what was your motivation to translate this text? Was it about the fact that you didn't think others were as authentic as they could have been to the writers of the Gita?
Well, it started its life as a course, a study course for the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, which is what I do mainly. I write courses. So as I was doing that, doing a course on the Bhagavad Gita, a translation became essential, and I did it for that originally. I wouldn't say my translation's any better than anybody else's. It's just one of many, and I would advise, particularly if you come to a passage which seems somewhat difficult or problematic, have a look at different translations of them. I've tried in the notes I give to offer different possibilities of translation, because I don't think there's any one that's absolutely right and any one that's absolutely wrong. So particularly with passages that perhaps aren't straightforward, I think it's advisable to have a look at one or two other works. But that was my primary motivation. It's creating courses for people like you to study and offering them a tool to help with that process. That was why I tried to do it. Plus they asked me to do it, so that was the reason.
Thank you. The next question is quite related. It's, to what extent do you feel you've been authentic to the writers of the Gita?
Well, I suppose obviously I do feel that I've presented the ideas that they're seeking to convey. I think sometimes as well, if you actually get right into the Gita, it's a very subtle text, and when I read it sometimes, it sometimes comes to mind that verse, that early verse where it says, Krishna spoke to Arjuna prahasaniva, as if he was smiling. Sometimes I get the impression that Krishna's slightly amused or enjoys playing with language, so he'll often use a word twice in close proximity but with a different meaning. Like he says, Pashyatmatmanam Atmana, seeing the Atman with the Atman. And then you have to, well, what does that mean? How can you see the Atman with the Atman? So, and you can see that Krishna's sort of enjoying the richness of the language and the multiplicity of meanings as he's putting the verses together. I mean, I've tried to do whatever I can to get across the actual meaning of the text itself. But I mean, the Gita, I sometimes say it's like when you buy a duvet in a shop and it comes in a little bag, you know, about this big, and you open it up and suddenly you've got this huge thing. So as soon as you start to tap at the Gita and work on it, such a varied a range of meanings come sprouting forth. Even a single word is packed in with meaning, and I'm not sure that it's ever really possible to, in a sort of straightforward translation, to capture the full depth and richness of the text. But what I've tried to do is just give some, I don't know, help and a little guidance in exploring that. But I would never say that the task is complete. Not for me, and I'm sure not for anyone else as well. You keep on and on tapping away and stirring, and more comes to the surface, I think. So I think that's probably what I would say. I'm not going to do myself down, but I mean, I've tried as far as possible to draw out as much of the meaning as is possible in a single text, without too much of my own prejudice coming through.
Thanks for that, Nick. What would you say has been the greatest difficulty in translating the text?
I think it's that point, actually. It's the multiplicity of potential meanings, and also trying to convert into a form of English language the depth of the meaning, and not reducing it to something too simplistic, to try and convey the full range of ideas that is packed into those relatively short Sanskrit verses, trying to make that available to people to the English speaking audience, you know, the fullness of the text. And I think that's a very difficult task to capture that, but one can but try. And I'm sure when you gather in a group and you discuss it, you're in a sense translating and retranslating and emerging with your own versions. And I think that's the way that it should be, that there is no final definitive version of it. Every time a group of people gather together and discuss it, then new meanings, new translations come to the fore. It's dynamic, it's not static at all. I think that would be the point. And in a sense, a book is a static form. And the problem is, I suppose, encapsulating something which is essentially dynamic into a static medium. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Throughout your translation, you use many Sanskrit words instead of English translations.
Mm.
But many times you use words like soul or God instead of the Sanskrit words used in the Gita. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah, and again, I might change that if I was to do it again and leave it as in fact, when I am doing texts today, I can't remember what I was working the other day. Oh yeah, the Mahabharata stuff. I tend to use Atman rather than translating it as the soul, and I think it is problematic, and perhaps with hindsight I should have left it at Atman. Particularly as, again, Zaina, he translates it, he uses soul as well, but he uses it in very much of the Western sense, where the soul is a mental faculty rather than the eternal spiritual element. So he translates buddhi as soul, whereas I've translated Atman, the eternal part of it. With regard to God, and again, sometimes criticized for using words like monotheistic or God, but I think I don't want, my reasoning there is, I don't want there to be a sense that only the Western traditions can use these terms in English, that Hindus don't have God, Hindus don't have monotheism, that they're exclusive property of Christianity or Islam or something like that, because Indian traditions do have an idea of God. It's not the same as the Western idea, but still they have a right, I think, to use those terms and that language. They're not excluded from it. So I think that's my reasoning as well. And the same with something like monotheism. Someone was criticizing the other day, saying that that's imposing a Western concept on something which is alien to Indian traditions. But what I would say to that is monotheism means belief in one supreme deity. And I would say the Gita is monotheistic because Krishna says, there's none superior to me. Regardless of the way the word monotheism has been used in the past, that is monotheism. So, you know, in a sense, every tradition has the right to use that language if they're speaking in English, regardless of the past usage of it. I don't think you can be excluded from it. I got this horrible resistance to the trappings of imperialism, which seem to still linger in some forms around it. Everybody has the right. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there?
Yes, yeah, it does, Nick. Thanks.
I mean, as I said, increasingly now in my translations, I've moved away from using English equivalents and retaining the Sanskrit terms, but, you know, it's a progressive process, if you like.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I quite liked your answer to that, Nick, because that's something that we've been discussing a lot. I think week after week we kind of ask the questions that, what do you mean by these words when you haven't translated it into when you have translated it into English but you've kept others. So it's nice to hear your answer to that. So just another one from me is, what do you mean when you are talking about Krishna?
What do I mean by it?
Yeah.
Oh, I hope I mean what the Gita means by Krishna himself. Who does Krishna define himself as? And that's really quite difficult. We did a course on, I think it's called Krishna in the Gita or God in the Gita. And they're looking at the way that Krishna defines himself. And it's clear from the words of the Gita, even disregarding the wider tradition of Krishna, that he represents himself, and indeed, as you've been reading in chapter 11, reveals himself to be the one supreme deity. He's the creator of the world, it says in chapter 9, verse 10. Miyajakshin prakritihi suyate sacharacharam. All things are brought into being under my control. But yet he also says that he pervades the world. In chapter 9, verse 4, Mayata tamidam sarvam jagat. All this world is pervaded by me. And again, Mai sarvamidam protum sutre munigana iva. I'm like the invisible thread that keeps the order of the world in place. So it's a different concept to the monotheism of Western religions, in as much as Krishna doesn't so much create the world from an external substance, but rather he expands it from out of his own divinity, if you like. He expands, and there's sometimes examples given of the spider expanding its web from out of it. So he is the creator, he is the controller, he's also the one who grants blessings, he feels compassion and love for living beings. That language is there. Krishna says, Yomad Bhakta Hasame Priyaha. You know, the word Priya, it means the beloved. The language of love is in the Gita. And also in chapter 10, verse 11, he explains why he helps us. Teshamevanu kampartam. Anukampa, it's a feeling of compassion for and he destroys our ignorance from within ourselves. So Krishna is the supreme monotheistic deity who creates and controls the world. It's his energy, his Shakti, if you like, which pervades the whole world and makes it what it is. And yet he's also present within each of us, not in a kind of sense of our dependence on him, but actually presence within as well as without. And I think all of those things can be found within the verses of the Gita. Is that the answer you were looking for at all, or do you want to?
I guess my question was also, so are you referring to Brahman when you talk about Krishna, or is it something else?
What you mean, the Upanishadic Brahman? Yes, I think so. Instead, I mean, the Gita is Upanishadic in that sense. It does draw on the wisdom of the Upanishads, but it's much more. Krishna says, "Mata parataram nanyat." There is nothing that is beyond me, and Krishna, unlike Brahman, is personal. He's a deity who forms relationships with the living beings of this world, which Brahman in the Upanishads doesn't do. Brahman just is the supreme reality. Krishna is an active deity. As I said, he has a relationship of love. He feels compassion. He acts and he delivers. What's he saying? Chapter 12, verse 7. Samudhartri, I lift them up. Mrityu samsara sagarat, from the ocean of birth and death, in a way that the Upanishadic Brahman never acts like that. So, yes, and Krishna can be equated with Brahman in the Upanishads, but at the same time, there's much more to Krishna in the Gita than there is to Brahman in the Upanishads. He's much more of a personal God, an interactive deity who forms relationships of love with those who reach out to him. Is that a reasonable response?
Yeah. Thanks for that.
I think that's really, I mean, in a sense, I would make the point there that the Gita thus is absolutely pivotal in the development of most Indian religious thought, in as much as it looks back to the Upanishadic revelation, and it quotes from the Upanishads on numerous occasions. But beyond that, it also looks forward to the intensely devotional forms of Indian religion that are so prevalent today. And it stands at that sort of unifying point of drawing the Upanishadic wisdom and then expanding it into the devotional religion that is so predominant in Hinduism today.
Thanks for that, Nick.
Okay.
I think as a collective, that's all the questions that we had, but has anyone got anything else to ask? Just unmute yourselves if you do.
It was just to follow up on one of the other things you said, Nick, when you said that the translations tend to be, obviously come from the point of view of a sampradaya. I was just wondering, do you feel like you yourself have been influenced by any particular sampradayas or collection? I mean, you kind of did say that very much more inclined towards the Ramakrishna, or kind of taking a lot more inspiration from there. I'm just trying to think that, do you feel you've got certain biases as well within yourself?
I'm sure that's right. My bias is, definitely I do have a bias, not particularly towards any sampradaya. I don't think. In many ways, my bias would be towards Shaivism. But I see a lot of the same ideas in the Gita that I find in Shaivism. Inevitably, one is influenced by one's own predispositions, but what is that? There's a verse in the Kularnava Tantra that Shiva says, some favor Advaita, some follow Dvaita, but neither of these understand me, for I am beyond both Advaita and Dvaita. I think there's a danger sometimes that it gets particularly rigid lines of discussion, and particularly when there's confrontation between them. I don't think the higher truths that the Gita is dealing with lend themselves to that kind of rigidly rationalistic approach. You can't describe Krishna using the forms of logic. So no, I don't think I do have a bias towards any particular sampradaya, Advaita or Dvaita. If I'm honest, my bias is always towards Dharma. And that's what I try to emphasize, because I've been around for a good number of years now. I was looking the other day, it's nearly 50 years since I first went to India in starting my quest. And what I've seen is that without Dharma, so many religious groups descend into something that is essentially useless, because they become deviated and materialistic, and the desire for position, fame, and money overwhelms them. And without Dharma, I think Dharma is the crucial test that that makes a religious tradition authentic. And without that rooting in Dharma, I don't think any of the spiritual endeavors ever come to fruition. I was at the Balaji temple at the youth camp there, and a young lad said to me, I think Hinduism is about being a good person, which sounds terribly bland. But at the same time, to be a good person is something absolutely tremendous, because it means that one has undergone a wholesale transformation of consciousness by which one is no longer self-centered, self-aggrandizing, and looks upon the world with an outlook that is utterly benign and full of compassion, etc. So that's Dharma. That's the consciousness of Dharma, and I think that's where my prejudices lie. That any spiritual endeavor must be laced through and through with the ideals of Dharma. That's where, if I am biased in that way. So a verse like chapter 7, verse 28, for example, is very important to me, because that verse, Yesham Tuntipatam Papam Jananam Punya Karmanam Dvanva Mohane Mukta Bhajante Mam Dridabrata. That verse gives you the path of knowledge, Dvanva Mohanir Mukta, being free from the illusion of duality, Bhajante Mam Dridabrata, and the path of bhakti, worshipping me. But the basis for both those endeavors, those spiritual paths that the Gita traces out, is Tvantagatam Papam, never doing anything which is wicked, which is harmful, which is cruel, which is malicious. Antagata Papa, all that Papa has gone away. And Punya Karmanam, and doing karma that is punya, that is full of virtue, kindness, compassion, goodwill. Then when you've got that fertile ground created with Dharma, then you can go on to move beyond the illusion of duality by following the path of knowledge, or worship Krishna, the deity, Shiva. But first of all, you've got to lay the fertile ground in which to lay the spiritual seeds. Otherwise, it'll just become a fashion accessory, or something you can show off to about your friends, or a way of making money. It'll never grow. It's like throwing the seeds of spirituality in a desert. The fertile ground always has to be Dharma. And I think that's what that verse 8 of chapter 7 is making that point. It's saying that you have to first create that fertile ground. That's been my observation as well, from all the years of meeting with spiritual and not so spiritual leaders, that Dharma is the crucial thing about what they do for Dharma. Yeah.
That was really beautifully put. Thank you, Nick.
Okay.
Has anyone got any other questions? Oh, have you got to go?
No, but I get a little tired sometimes.
Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
So, despite, I'm sure, the incredible sort of complexity and layers of meaning that you could go on and on forever, kind of extracting from the Gita, what kind of strikes me about the book and why it's so impacting for me is that it contains some really kind of basic and simple and sort of easily understandable sort of core principles for spiritual life. For example, giving up the fruits of your action, not being sort of training yourself not to be affected by sort of extremes, pleasure and pain, and withdrawing your senses, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on I don't know, kind of transmitting these very jewels of wisdom that are in the Gita to kind of Western modern society. And it's kind of like in a radical worldview, it's kind of ethos and kind of sees the world, has some fundamental assumptions about the world which aren't embraced by the wider society in which we live. But I just think it's very interesting to think about how kind of moving those ideas out to a broader.
I agree with you completely. In my view, the Gita is an utterly revolutionary text. You know, when I was quite young, I was a member of the Communist Party, and I was schooled in Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, etc. But the Gita is far more revolutionary than those, far more revolutionary, because what it's advocating is a fundamental inversion of the basic tenets on which our society is based, which are consumption, accumulation, pleasure. And the Gita is making the point that this is a completely false path to follow. Give it all up, and you will only find real satisfaction in life when you give up all that hankering, longing. And I was just reading today, I've been working on the Yoga Sutras today. Shankaracharya, or maybe Shankaracharya, has got a commentary on the Yoga Sutras, and that point came up there because what he says is that when you acquire pleasure, then you always do it by giving suffering to someone else. And therefore, your pursuit of pleasure is at someone's expense. And he was making the point about particularly sacrificial rituals, killing animals. But I was thinking about that in our economic situation. We're wealthy and we enjoy so many things, but somebody's paying for it. People in poorer countries, the poorer people who are deprivation, are suffering to pay for our wealth. And really that's what the Gita is saying as well. You've got to give up that self-centered focus, thinking what's for me, what's for me, what's for me. And Krishna says that, doesn't he? He says loka sangrahamevapi sampasyan, thinking only of the well-being of the world. Kartamarhasi, you have to take action. I remember I was thinking about that verse. I think I'd just been speaking about it the night before, and I woke up one morning and I saw in Birmingham there was a march against climate change. And I woke up, I was watching the news and I saw it, and it said, and I thought of that verse, Loka sangrahamevapi sampasyan kartamarhasi. When that word seemed to come down and hit me, kartamarhasi, you must take action. So I got out of bed and I went and joined the march there as well. So Krishna's still speaking to me down there. Kartamarhasi, get off your backside, get out, go and do something. But it's fundamentally, it's completely an inverse of what we're indoctrinated as children, which is all about accumulate, gather wealth, buy, consume. You need this, that, this, that, this, that, and then you'll enter paradise, the consumer paradise. The Gita, in a way that Marx never does, utterly rejects that view and tells you to move in another direction, which thinks, what does Krishna say at the conclusion? Maupanyena sarvatra samam pasyati sukham vayadi vadukam, that you feel the pain of others as your own pain, and then kartamarhati, you do whatever you can to act. You see my bias is coming out again there, but I think that's there in the Gita, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a completely dangerous, revolutionary document that overthrows the assumptions of capitalist culture, if you like, in a far more radical sense than the Communist Manifesto ever does. It's completely subversive. It's saying basically you don't need any of this stuff. You don't need any of it. You don't need all the things that you trained to hanker after. So I agree with you completely on that point. I think it is a totally revolutionary document, the Gita. Is that what you're asking about, or is that just me going off on a tangent?
No, yeah, I mean, it's great to hear you speak with such passion about the revolutionary impact of the Gita. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, and just thinking, I guess I'm interested in thinking about, well, like, how could just the seeds, like the seeds of the Gita, like, I guess what's beautiful about it is, you can sow those seeds in a kind of innocent and sort of non-partisan fashion, but they've got the sort of wisdom within them to create that awakening within people to fundamentally question the basis of the way that we're living. So I'm just really interested in initiatives to do that, really, and how you can sort of go about, I don't know, I guess as a bit a religious text, it can seem something that's difficult to make sort of, not applicable, but to kind of bridge that between people living just normal lives who aren't necessarily Hindu.
But it applies to all of us, doesn't it? I mean, it's that transformation of consciousness away from me-centered to the whole world we focus on. We don't draw those distinctions, and that's why I say it's, if one follows it. But another point I must make before we go off is, sometimes what Krishna says in the Gita seems so impossibly difficult to accomplish. Can we become completely selfless and not do anything for ourselves? But in verse 40 of chapter 2, Krishna says, Svalpamapyasya dharmasya trayate mohatobayad. Su alpam, even a little bit of this dharma that I'm teaching is incredibly potent in delivering us from fear. It's not all or nothing. It's little bits, a little bit more karma yoga, a little bit less self-centered. So if you're doing a little bit more for others today, a little bit today, a little bit more tomorrow, and so until the practice becomes the instinct, if you like, instinctively one is benign towards other living beings.
Of course. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you very much for joining.
It's wonderful to meet you all.